Please open your minds and hearts to the words of Reverend Jennifer Butler.
This is the coolest thing ever. My back thanks you. Thank you, first off, to Willow for that incredible selection of music and for the work that you do for justice by lifting up your voices. That was really powerful. And thank you to Katie, I think it is, who put together this flower arrangement today and figured out how to represent the fierce urgency and the flames of fire up here in the form of flowers. What a joy it is to be here in this congregation that has labored so long and with so much foresight to build up organizing networks throughout the country that are holding the tide of justice and building democracy even now as we gather here this morning. And it is so exciting to be here with these powerful sisters over here. Can you all just stand up so they can see you? Because you have a chance to meet them this afternoon at lunch. So please, please join us for the lunchtime conversation. I tell you, these women will bring it, and you need to meet them. The book of Exodus, arguably the most important book of the Bible, begins with the stories of 3 sets of women who hear the cries of oppression and act. In ancient Egypt, Pharaoh ordered the midwives Shiphrah and Puah to become agents of death. Can you imagine? You are a midwife and you are asked to kill babies. But they resist by strategically manipulating Pharaoh's fears, his ignorance of childbirth, and his squeamishness about it. Your Excellency, the Hebrew women, they just pop those children out and they're gone before we even get there. I can imagine his eyes growing wide with fear. And knowing women, I bet you the work of the midwives was a massive organizing effort throughout the empire. That effort extended to families who, though told to throw their firstborn into the Nile, would pretend to comply and then float their children safely down rafts in the river. And it was a conspiracy, too, of elite women, one who lived in Pharaoh's house, Pharaoh's daughter. Her name was Bitya. And she conspired to save Moses, even as Moses' mom and sister conspired to save him. This was early organizing against tyranny. This woman-led conspiracy also lays the foundation for the entire Bible. Some people see Exodus as actually the first book of the Bible. In chapter 1, the very first thing you hear is these 3 women organizing resistance. And then, at the end of the story, we hear about God. And what we learn about God is a God who hears our cries, who hears the groans of people in slavery and people who are oppressed. That God is like a midwife. That God is like a mother who hears the cries of pain and acts. The stories of brave women do not end in Exodus, but they echo throughout history. During the Civil War, 2 unsung heroes worked together to alter the course of the war. Elizabeth Van Lew was a wealthy white slaveholder in Richmond, Virginia, and she freed her slaves. And one of her slaves was named Mary Bowser. And Mary went off to college after being freed and became a career missionary. These 2 women, one white, one privileged, the other a formerly enslaved person, operated one of the most important spy networks of the Civil War. Elizabeth, through her wealthy connections, got Mary a position in the Confederate White House in Richmond. Mary was able to hide in plain sight because Jefferson Davis could not imagine that a slave woman was as smart as Mary, and Mary used that to her advantage. I picture Mary serving tea over Jefferson Davis' shoulder and looking at his battle plans. And he's like, duh, I don't know any, he's not even noticing. And legend has it, she had a photographic memory. So she's like, snap, snap, snap. She copies them, she gets them to Elizabeth. They channel them to the Union Army. And at one point, Jefferson Davis says, my God, my battle plans are falling into the hands of the enemy before I can even get them to my own troops. He says this, we have it in writing. After the war, Ulysses S. Grant paid them a visit, and they said, you all have brought me the most valuable information of the war. They helped win the Civil War, these two women, working together. In the face of personal danger, because Mary and Elizabeth, they risked their lives, they risked captivity. And together, Shiphrah, Puah, and Bitra, standing up to a violent tyrant. Even in a patriarchal world that our scripture was written in, it makes clear that it is women who lead the way, who first understand who God is. That these three women set the stage in Exodus reminds us that women have unique ways of leading against tyranny, against tyrants. Think about it. Miriam, Vashti, Esther, Hagar, Ruth, Naomi, Rahab, Elizabeth, and Mary, they all set off powerful chains of events that changed the course of human history. It's vital that these stories survive, that they're not erased by patriarchal culture. We have to lift up these stories as they are a potent reminder of how women lead the way. Growing up as a woman in the South, my voice was often ignored. As a product of newly integrated public schools, I grew up under the tutelage of powerful Black women teachers. And yet, I saw the racism that was rampant in the South despite our lip service to have become a new South. Worse yet, I saw Christianity increasingly used to justify racism and homophobia and sexism. It was all over the nightly news in the form of the moral majority in Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Yet there were no voices to counter the faith that I was growing into, the one that calls us to bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. That's what it's all about, from Genesis all the way through. In my 20s, I grew so discouraged by some sexism and hypocrisy that I saw that I nearly left the church. And that was a problem because I had studied to be ordained. So I was in a crisis. The turning point for me came when I was working in the global women's movement. The Christian right had begun to organize resistance to women on the basis of religion. They were saying that women's rights were not biblical, and they were dividing the nations of the world on women's rights. So I teamed up with women of all faiths and from all over the world to counter that. And at one point, we helped sponsor an event for Muslim women in solidarity with them. And these were Muslim women living under religious extremism. We cleared the communion table in a chapel across from the UN. It was this big, heavy concrete slab. And we had no other choice but to make it the table for the panelists. And first, it was that vision of Muslim women gathered around the communion table that stirred something new in my soul. Second, it was the disruption of Saudi Arabian security guards who entered the room to intimidate the women midway through the event. As the guards attempted to physically intimidate them, the global community of women of faith all rose to their feet, 200 of them, and began to applaud wildly for like 3 minutes. And the shaken speaker was then able to continue her presentation. And the women by the door stood on their feet the whole time, casually, just blocking the guards from view so the women didn't have to see them. And I decided then and there, if Muslim women living with such intimidation could reclaim their voice and their faith, then I sure as hell could too. I had to realize that how dare I let patriarchal leaders rob me of my faith. Right then and there, I decided that I would get ordained with the goal of bringing liberationist and feminist theology to a world of pain and hurt and injustice. They could not take my voice as a woman or my theological voice and my spirituality. I was reminded of that moment last spring when I teamed up, the organization I lead, Faith in Public Life, teamed up with an organization known as Moms Rising. And we were going up to Capitol Hill to witness the Homeland Secretary testimony, Kirsten Nielsen, about child separation. The newly elected House was having hearings on child separation. So we were there to bear witness and to let the world know we were watching and wanted truth to come out. Moms Rising had made these onesies with the names of children who had been killed, basically, in detention through neglect of our detention facilities. As I waited to go into the hearing, a Capitol police officer came up and called me by name. Reverend Butler, what are you up to today? I didn't know him. I could only figure that he recognized me from a mugshot. To be clear, I'd been arrested protesting the attempt to gut the Affordable Care Act. I imagined he had mugshots of all the religious leaders and activists on his walls. He had a cell phone to his ear and he looked very, very worried. He said, "I just need to let you know that if you hold that onesie up in the hearing, you will be arrested." Imagine that, the power of a onesie to drive fear into the hearts of Congress. Our creativity and moral authority as women is critical to countering tyranny. Sometimes, my friends, we don't know the power that we have. Today, our democracy is fundamentally threatened. White supremacy is on the rise, encouraged by our president. People of color and religious minorities are constantly under attack by white terrorists. The Fourth Estate, or the media, has been undermined by the influence of media, of money, and of the internet. Money in politics and a new type of gerrymandering that started in the 90s has nearly locked power into the hands of one political party. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted. It was gutted. It can't be enforced anymore. And the rights of people of color are being suppressed. The right to vote is being suppressed. Our nation's prison and jail population has quintupled in 30 years. And it is not because of increased crime. It's because of racism. Plans are being made to deport and imprison millions of immigrants. Refugees are now unwelcome here. And moral norms like human dignity and love of neighbor are being undermined in favor of the values of greed and xenophobia and white nationalism. And ironically, it is white Christians, evangelicals, who are helping to give cover to such efforts. And to be clear, there are many within the evangelical community that are resisting as well, but our faith is often being used to give cover to the gutting of democracy. For several years, the Christian right has controlled the narrative and turned out voters for anti-democratic purposes. So let me say this, that tyrants will try to control faith because it is powerful. We cannot let them do that. We must step into this world with the confidence of our moral vision and our moral authority, with showing respect for all traditions. Tyrants will try to convince us that women cannot get elected, and we must make sure that they do. Tyrants will try to tell us that our organizing efforts against corporate powers are impossible to overcome. And we only have to know our history to know that organizing can succeed against impossible odds. There are so many stories that we barely know, and I encourage us to learn about the unsung heroes, many of them women who overcame incredible odds. The Unitarian Universalist Beach program at Shelter Rock is legendary. You all may not know this because you sit inside this building, but out there in the world, people know the Beach program and they know this congregation for the vision that it has had. Without you, there would be meager capacity for grassroots groups to organize, for women of color in particular to organize. Without you, there would be very little in the way of a progressive religious voice to counter the religious right. It is time to double down on these efforts and enable our communities to reclaim our voices to save democracy. When a former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced plans to torture immigrant children at the border by removing them from their parents, the organizing networks that you all have built, that these women have helped build, because of you, they leapt into action. Within days, we had 500 women faith leaders from all over the country rallying in front of the Customs and Border Patrol offices in Washington, D.C. I was told our voices were so loud that it rattled the glass of the building and disturbed the poor conferees within. And days after that, my organization led a delegation of women to the border called Women Cry Out. We bore witness at detention centers where we were threatened with arrest for wanting to pray. We went into courthouses and teamed up with legal groups to challenge the system of deportation. And we visited Catholic respite centers and met families that had escaped the turmoil and were fleeing for safety. Because of the outcry from faith communities in particular, the Attorney General was livid. Now, I used to be afraid of anger. I've learned that anger is now a sign that you are doing things right. Sounds like you know what I mean. So Sessions chose a gathering of law enforcement officials to deliver a sermon. Go figure. The man pulls out Romans 13, and he tells Christians basically to shut up and sit down. He says, obey the laws of government because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. The faith community was livid, and they lashed out and made every headline in the country. And it was a broad range of groups that pushed back on him. Romans 13 is actually, the conclusion of it is that all law has to fulfill the command to love. The Apostle Paul, who wrote Romans 13, spent a fair amount of time in jail for disobeying laws, unjust laws. And most grave of all, what we pointed out was our history, that slave owners had used that very verse to defend slavery against abolitionism. Can you believe it? Dr. Martin Luther King put it this way, writing from an Alabama prison to white moderates who thought he was being just a little too confrontational. They were getting a little nervous. He wrote, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Jeff Sessions thought he could rally the faith community to his vision of white supremacy, or at least get us to cower. And we said no. We lifted up our vision of love of neighbor and love for every human being. All social change starts with imagination. A people who can imagine a world differently is a people who cannot be controlled by tyrants. A tyrannical leader will try to paralyze you by saying that your God or your moral vision for the world is too small and that his or her vision of greed and exploitation is the only thing that will keep you safe. Tyrants will tell you that you're too idealistic, that this is simply the way of the world. Don't be such a bleeding heart. Tyrants will try to divide us across race and class through fear and rumor and hatred. Tyrants will try to overwhelm us with the belief that they cannot be brought down. Do not listen to that voice. You stand in the lineage of rebel women of Exodus. Follow the cries for help. We follow a God who hears the groans of slaves, and we follow a God who works through women, the life givers of humanity and history. What this ancient story and movement history in Exodus teaches us is that it is the tyrant that is small. The tyrant is the one who is afraid of our solidarity, afraid of our moral vision, afraid of our compassion, afraid of our organizing across race and class. So I ask you today, do you know the power that you have? Your moral vision, your organizing has and will protect the world against the tyranny of the pharaohs of this world. So thank you.